Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the Whitmans' sumptuous mansion, a heavy silence reigned despite the ostentatious luxury of the place. The patriarch, Edward Whitman, a sharp-witted 78-year-old with an iron will, surveyed the vast garden stretching out before him from his study. Age had wrinkled his face, but not his foresight. He knew that his family's loyalty was fragile, especially that of his only son, Christopher Whitman, ambitious and greedy, ready to do anything to inherit the family empire. Christopher, his face hidden behind a mask of politeness, had just betrayed his father. He had secretly orchestrated the sale of several key assets of the family business to an unscrupulous competitor, hoping to get rich quickly and seize control even before Edward's death. This betrayal, invisible to the world, was not to the patriarch. Edward had guessed everything. And in that moment when the son thought he had the upper hand, the old man offered a cold smile. For Edward Whitman was not merely a feared businessman, he was a strategist, a master at transforming revenge into a work of art. He knew that inheritance could be a weapon as sharp as a blade. And in his will, he was already preparing a counterattack Christopher hadn't even suspected, a revenge so methodical and cruel that it would change his life forever. Evening fell on the house, and with the shadows of the candlesticks dancing on the walls, the patriarch wrote his last will and testament. Each word, each clause, was a painful lesson for the one who had dared betray him. The son, certain of his victory, was unaware that true power lay in the hands of the old man, behind the silent pen that would seal his fate. The morning was gray and heavy over New York City. In the glass-walled office overlooking Central Park, Christopher Whitman savored his silent victory. The documents he had secretly signed the day before, without his father's knowledge, had transferred the majority of the family business to an ambitious competitor, ready to restructure and eliminate anyone who opposed him. Christopher felt invincible. He already imagined himself at the head of the Whitman empire, controlling billions of dollars and imposing his will on everyone. But what he didn't know was that Edward Whitman was watching everything from his living room downstairs, with a lucidity that shattered any illusion of security. "You think you can outdo me, Christopher?" Edward murmured, looking at a picture of his son next to one of his late wife, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and cold anger. The old man knew that revenge shouldn't be impulsive. It had to be perfect, irresistible, and above all, humiliating for the one who had dared betray him. In the hours that followed, Edward reviewed his assets, his contracts, and especially the will, which he hadn't updated since his wife's death. Every clause would be rewritten to transform Christopher's betrayal into his own prison. Meanwhile, Christopher celebrated his manipulation. He phoned his accomplices at the rival company, laughing at their eagerness to serve him. But behind the walls of the Whitman house, the patriarch was plotting his revenge. Edward knew he could never win his son back emotionally, but he could destroy him where Christopher felt most invincible, his wealth and status. And when the day the will was read arrived, the son would discover that every maneuver he thought was clever was actually a step toward his downfall. A few weeks had passed since Christopher's betrayal. The patriarch's shadow now loomed over every decision the son made, without him even realizing it. Edward Whitman, with the meticulousness of a chess master, had begun to sow the seeds of his revenge. It all began with subtle changes within the company. Contracts Christopher believed to be firm were mysteriously cancelled or redirected to partners more loyal to the patriarch. Investors, once eager to support Christopher's schemes, suddenly became suspicious and delayed their financial commitments. The son, perplexed, felt his empire crumbling around him, but he still refused to suspect his father. One morning, while impatiently checking his emails, Christopher noticed a strange document titled Special Will Clause, Total Confidentiality. Curious but arrogant, he assumed it was merely a legal formality and decided to ignore it. This was exactly what Edward wanted, for his son to underestimate the extent of his counterattack. The patriarch, for his part, saw everything. Every call, every satisfied smile from Christopher, every moment the son thought he was in control, fed into his strategy. Edward had already consulted his lawyers to rewrite the will, inserting unexpected clauses. Certain portions of the inheritance would go to charities, others to deserving employees, and the rest only under certain conditions that would be humiliating for Christopher. One evening, during a family dinner, Christopher tried to provoke his father, trying to gauge his reaction. "Dad, aren't you worried about losing control? I think everything is already underway," he said with a confident smile. Edward replied calmly, a slight ironic smile playing at the corners of his lips, "I'm not worried, my boy. After all, true control isn't measured in documents or figures, but in patience and discernment." Christopher didn't understand the threat in those words, but the tension in the room was palpable. The patriarch had begun his silent revenge, and soon, every action by the son would bring him closer to his own humiliation, exactly as Edward had planned. The following days were a true nightmare for Christopher. Every decision he made seemed to backfire, as if an invisible force were guiding his failures. Business partners he thought were loyal suddenly became reluctant, investors demanded additional guarantees, and key Whitman contracts were systematically called into question. Furious, Christopher began searching for someone to blame. He questioned his colleagues, scoured the files, but no one could explain the series of inexplicable setbacks. Anxiety began to set in. Every time he thought he had found a solution, a new complication would arise, meticulously orchestrated. Meanwhile, Edward Whitman watched everything with satisfaction. His revenge wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Every failure of his son was a cruel reminder that betrayal has a price. And the worst was yet to come. One day, Christopher received an urgent letter from the family bank. The majority of his personal funds, which had been unattended until then, had been frozen by a special clause stipulated in his father's will, a clause of which Christopher was completely unaware. This clause, meticulously drafted by Edward, had been automatically activated at the slightest attempt at financial manipulation. Furious and distraught, Christopher rushed into his father's office. "Dad! You have to tell me what you've done. It's impossible, everything is falling apart," he yelled, his face red with rage. Edward, sitting behind his desk with icy serenity, stared at him calmly. "Christopher, you thought you were fooling me. You thought your father was past his prime. But the truth, my son, is that betrayal always has a price. And yours is only just beginning to be revealed." Christopher felt a new fear grip him. He had underestimated his father, his strategy, and his patience. Every move he had thought calculated to enrich himself and seize control of the family empire had been but a step toward his own downfall. Edward Whitman's patient and methodical revenge had just struck its first blows. The day of the reading of the will finally arrived. In the great hall of the Whitman mansion, lawyers, notaries, and family members were gathered. The atmosphere was electric. Christopher thought this would be the final triumph of his audacity. But he didn't know that this day would seal his defeat and reveal the full extent of his father's strategy. The lead lawyer spoke, opening the imposing document. Each clause seemed innocuous at first glance, but Christopher's smile quickly froze. Unexpected conditions appeared. A massive portion of the inheritance had been legalized for the benefit of charities, ensuring that Christopher does not could only affect a symbolic fraction of the Fortune family. The company's key actions, which Christopher believed under his control, were now transferred to a council independent, composed of collaborators loyal to Edward, with the strict order to protect the company against all manipulation. And the cruelest clause, any access to the funds or inherited privileges required Edward's direct approval. Whitman, even after his death. A total humiliation for him. Who had thought he could outdo his father? Christopher felt his world crumble. The silent room watched his reaction. The once arrogant son, who had already envisioned himself as master of the family empire, was now reduced to powerlessness, crushed by the subtlety and cruelty of his father's revenge. Edward, motionless behind his desk, looked at him with cold satisfaction. "Christopher, you thought I had it all. You betrayed your father, but you forgot a simple truth: no one knows an empire better than the one who built it. And no one knows his son better than his own father." Christopher's humiliation was complete. Not only did he lose the majority of the inheritance, but his reputation and ego were now irrevocably shattered. He had thought himself more cunning than his father, but Edward had transformed every betrayal into a tool of vengeance, every ambition into a trap, until the son found himself alone, powerless, facing the patriarch's unwavering intelligence and determination. That day, Christopher painfully understood that true power lay not in wealth or manipulation, but in patience, strategy, and absolute mastery of every detail, qualities Edward Whitman had always possessed. And in this cruel game, the old man had achieved total victory.